There is a corner of Europe that is covered by dense woods and endless marshland. Small cities dot the otherwise flat and still mostly wild landscape. The Baltic Sea, from which this region gets its name, is cold but calm, as are its countless estuaries. The Baltics, which are the modern states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were the focal point of a pagan culture that existed longer than anywhere else in Europe. Today we will talk about what these pagans believed in, how they managed to stay pagan for so long, and why they finally joined the fray of Christian nations in 1387. My name is Ivan, welcome back to History Chats. Let's do this. Our story starts in the 9th century. The first thing to mention is that hardly anyone lived in the Baltic states back then. There was too little good farmland, you had to deal with dense forests, treacherous marshland, and tons of rivers. Hardly anyone went there, as there was not much to trade, and the few people that actually lived there did not venture out very far from their homes. We know that these people organized themselves into tribes and lived in tiny wooden settlements, but besides that we really have no idea. Their culture relied solely on oral communication, so most information about them simply disappeared. In the 9th century, the Baltic tribes faced a problem that half of Europe was facing: the Vikings. There was really nothing that these Baltic people could do to oppose them, and so the Vikings came to rule over them. This change in leadership did not change the fundamental facts of this region, namely that it was lacking in everything that made a realm rich. Many of the Norsemen simply moved on to other lands that seemed more promising, and the ones that stayed gradually assimilated. They likely caused significant changes in the pagan faith, as one of the chief gods we can identify was Perkūnas, a god of thunder that was incredibly similar to the Norse god Thor. I know I just implied that there was one single pagan faith, but the trouble with talking about what these people believed in is that they believed in different things at different times and places, and they didn't write any of this down either. We know with decent certainty that there was a wide variety of gods that included such characters as Dievas, the supreme sky god, and Gediminas, the goddess of the earth, as well as Velis, the smith god. Sometimes the names were different, sometimes the stories were different. Gods were worshipped not in buildings, but outside in holy tree groves. Many other parts of nature were also worshipped, such as springs and rivers, as well as many animals. Green snakes in particular were seen as good omens and best buddies that would help protect a home against evil spirits. There were hardly any priests, just people who claimed to know the gods. Sometimes they helped people get through bad harvests, sometimes they burned animals or humans as a sacrifice. Fire, like other parts of nature, was holy. Paganism, both in the Baltics and in most other places, consisted of many different stories that were mixed together. On a purely narrative level, Christianity, as well as other organized religions, had an edge as it told one single story that was far less likely to contradict itself. But the transition from paganism should not be seen as merely an issue of what people believed in and what religious rules they had to follow. The Vikings that were so actively raiding and reaving in the 9th century started converting to Christianity and leaving their more violent past behind them by the late 10th century. Adopting Christianity is often associated with major social change. We will go into the how and the why a little later so we can put it in a Baltic context, but for now it would be good to keep in mind that converting to Christianity was about a lot more than faith. Christianity had been steadily replacing various pagan faiths across Europe since the 4th century, and by the early 11th century the process was largely complete. The issue of converting the Baltic tribes only attracted attention once Poland and the Kievan Rus became Christian in 966 and 988 respectively. The two powers were the most immediate neighbors of the Baltics. Poland doesn't need much explanation, but the Kievan Rus was essentially the predecessor of modern Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The people that lived there were called Rus or Ruthenians. With the conversion of these two states, it became at least logistically possible for Christians to get to the Baltics. The first missionary to cross into the lands of the Baltic tribes was Saint Adalbert. He was originally Czech and made his way to Poland, where the king sent him into Prussia. The king hoped that converting more people would gain him favor with the Pope. In 997, Adalbert preached in a Prussian settlement for the first time and was fiercely rejected by the locals. The local chief slapped him on the head with an oar and told him to get lost. He was met with a similar reaction in multiple other villages before he got to a place called Trousseau, where he was killed by a mob and his head was paraded around on a pike. It is likely that above all else, the decision to preach to these people from a book antagonized them greatly. Baltic society was based on the oral tradition. Reading from a book, as well as books themselves, was literally unheard of and may have been interpreted as something evil. Some others, like Bruno of Querfurt, tried the same approach, but were also killed. Further attempts faced tons of obstacles. In 1054, the schism of the Church split Europe into the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. The Baltics were tucked in right between the two sides, which made it a lot easier to play one side off against the other. The fragmentation of Poland in 1115 further complicated things. For about 150 years, this large Catholic neighbor was preoccupied with reassembling itself and so did not have much thought to spare for Baltic pagans. There was a major change in Catholic policy while all this was happening. In 1096, the First Crusade got going in the Middle East. In time, decision-makers in the church realized that they could also organize a crusade against the pagans. The first of these European crusades was the Wendish Crusade. The Wends were Western Slavic pagans that lived in what is today Eastern Germany, and in 1147 they were crushed by Christian lords from the surrounding lands. Their quick implosion might lead you to wonder why the forces of Catholic Europe did not simply band together and go into the Baltics if they wanted to Christianize them so badly. But here's the thing, the Wends were surrounded by major Catholic kingdoms. They had been exposed to Christianity to the point where entire cities under their control were already Catholic. And on top of that, their lands were rich in resources. Christian lords were eager to crusade against the Wends to take their wealth for themselves. Contrast this to the isolated, sparsely populated, and thoroughly pagan Baltics, and you see why a crusade against them might have been more difficult. Catholic Europe only got interested in the Baltics once commercial interests coincided with political ones. Trade in the Baltic Sea picked up significantly in the 12th century, and by 1159, German merchants had negotiated terms that allowed them to trade at the mouth of the Daugava River in modern Latvia. Missionaries followed merchants, and by 1186, a bishopric was established there. It was the first permanent church in the Baltics, but at this point it was still mostly focused on the foreign merchants who were already Christians. The pagans did not really have a problem with foreigners practicing their own religion. The Christian god was perhaps seen by some of the pagans as just one more god that certain people chose to follow. What did cause tension was when the Christians tried to preach to the locals, as this threatened the established order of things. A fresh crusade had its origins in 1198. The second bishop of Livonia, a guy called Bertold of Hanover, tried to spread Christianity by force. If you're wondering about the term Livonia, well, that is just what the area of today's Estonia and Latvia was called at the time. After spending a few years as a missionary in Latvia, he got promoted and was allowed to preach in support of a Baltic crusade by the Pope. He went back to Germany to do this until he thought he had gathered enough soldiers. But back in Latvia, his militaristic attitude was not appreciated by the locals, who stabbed him in the back with a spear. The joke was on them though, because the next guy, Albert, was much worse. The killing of Bertold and his companions provoked outrage across Christian Europe. Even the Pope thought that it was time for revenge. Albert of Bexhövede, another German, was named bishop and set off for Latvia. From early 1200, he led a campaign to forcibly Christianize as much of the Baltics as possible. He was very dedicated to his job. He founded Riga, which today is the capital of Latvia, in 1201 as a center of Christianity and crusading. Next year, he established a religious order by the name of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Their purpose was to organize the crusading activities. They were meant to build and garrison castles, fight pagans, and do whatever else necessary to protect and spread Christianity. Adalbert did everything in his power to put the crusade as high up on the agenda of the Christian world as possible, and by 1218 succeeded in getting the Pope to declare it equal in importance to the crusades against the Muslim states in the Middle East. Utilizing divide and conquer strategies, as well as frankly superior technology, Adalbert and the gang succeeded in conquering most of modern Estonia and Latvia by the time he died, peacefully, in 1229. Losing a war did not result in the pagans just giving up. There were many uprisings, and people frequently reverted to their original pagan faith whenever they felt like the Crusaders had stopped paying attention to them. The existential threat of being converted and colonized hardened the resolve of many pagans not yet under Christian rule, most of which by that point were in Lithuania. We see a Lithuanian state start to emerge at the same time that the crusade kicks into high gear, which is not a coincidence. The first mention of a Lithuanian state is in a document from 1219, though by that point it was still more a confederation between various chieftains and their tribes. They were able to understand the technologies and tactics of their Christian enemies and coordinated their resistance so that by 1236 they were able to inflict a crushing defeat on the Crusaders at Saula. This inspired more revolts, and the situation got so bad that the Livonian Brothers of the Sword had to be dissolved and united with another order, the Teutons. The Teutons were also a German-dominated military order that decided to start Christianizing Prussia in 1230 rather than also going to Livonia. As the Prussians lived in the west and Livonia was in the north, the Lithuanians were now threatened by the same force from two different sides. The Teutons managed to pull off a pretty destructive attack that reached deep into Lithuania in 1249 or 1250, which provoked an unexpected response: the conversion of Lithuania to Christianity. The pagan state had matured, and part of this process was a centralization of power in the hands of one of the chieftains. His name was Mindaugas. Sometimes between 1236 and 1245, he became the supreme ruler of Lithuania by marrying and killing the right people. By becoming the supreme ruler, he also became the supreme enemy of the Teutonic Order, and so they conspired to overthrow him. They had an ally in Tautvilas, a relative of Mindaugas, who was baptized in Riga in 1250. The plan was to invade, kill Mindaugas, and install Tautvilas as a Christian king. The only way for Mindaugas to preempt this threat was to agree to become Christian himself. While this may have been the trigger, it was not the only reason. Becoming Christian would bring many benefits. Not only would the war with the Teutonic Order have to end, it also facilitated access to the rest of Europe. Trade would surely increase, innovations from abroad could be imported, more resilient institutions and thus a more resilient society could be created. Mindaugas was baptized in early 1251, and by July news of his conversion reached Rome. The Pope was very pleased. He immediately initiated the process of establishing church institutions within Lithuania and did what he could to legitimize Mindaugas as a Christian ruler. But the Pope was not just hype about there being more Christians. Parts of the Christian world had become increasingly interested in working together with Lithuania. In the late 1230s, the Mongol Empire was still expanding westward and reached the borders of the Kievan Rus. Obviously, this meant war, and the Ruthenians really didn't have a chance. This massive but loosely bound state started disintegrating altogether as a result of these pressures, but the death of the Mongol ruler in 1241 caused a lull in the fighting. Lithuanians had been raiding into the Ruthenian lands for a while, so this was a great opportunity for them to establish more permanent control. During Mindaugas' lifetime, Lithuania expanded as far south as today's capital of Belarus, Minsk, meaning that an increasing proportion of the population consisted of Orthodox Ruthenians. In this situation, the Pope and other powerful Christians had two hopes regarding Lithuania. Basically, they hoped that they would be a good ally in the fight against the Mongols, and that they would convert all these Orthodox people and thus expand Catholicism even further into Eastern Europe. Back in Lithuania, things seemed to be going well for Mindaugas. The Teutonic Order switched sides and started helping him crush his enemies. He even convinced the Pope to crown him King of Lithuania, which happened in July of 1253. He would actually be the only person to hold this title. See, below the surface, things were actually not going well at all. The Catholic Church faced great difficulties in establishing its power structures. In other countries, the church was funded both through taxes and through land it owned directly. In Lithuania, the common people, most of whom remained pagan, literally never paid taxes before, so starting to now was asking a lot of them. They were also not used to firm property relations. Some dude from the church showing up with a piece of paper saying he owned the whole town now and that everyone who lived there would have to start paying rent for land they had lived on for centuries would have provoked confusion and probably violence. Without money, the church could not hope to go about converting pagans en masse. The problem was particularly acute in a region of Lithuania called Žemaitija. People that lived there bore the brunt of the attacks that came from the Teutonic Order, so they weren't so quick to forget and move on. They wanted to remain pagan and had little respect for Mindaugas in the first place. They kept on fighting the Teutonic Order, and on the 13th of July, 1260, inflicted a decisive defeat. The Battle of Durba saw many of the Crusaders killed, including multiple commanders. Across Lithuania, people saw the Catholic Mindaugas and Teutonic Order as weak, and the pagan Žemaitians as strong. And not only in Lithuania, in Prussia too, the pagans started an uprising that lasted for 14 years and preoccupied the remainder of the Teutonic Order. If you think the situation looks pretty bad for Mindaugas at this point, just wait. What I have failed to mention is that before the Žemaitians even score their big dub, Lithuania is invaded by the Mongols. The massive Mongol armies easily overcome Lithuanian resistance. Their invasion and occupation only lasts a few years between 1258 and 1261, but has the effect of just completely destroying what little progress had been made towards a stable Lithuanian state. People are killed, houses are looted, villages burn. There are barely any signs of life, and Catholic Europe starts acting like the Christian kingdom of Lithuania just sunk below the waves. Mindaugas was able to cling on, but his days were numbered. In 1261, he breaks his alliance with the Teutonic Order. Sometimes this is interpreted as him reverting to paganism, but it seems more likely that he was doing this to hopefully win over the pagan Žemaitians. They remained unimpressed, instead choosing to place their bets on his nephew. That nephew assassinates Mindaugas and two of his sons before himself being killed on the orders of Mindaugas' last surviving son a few months later. Chaos and destitution then consumed the country. Why did this first attempt fail? Mindaugas certainly faced many challenges. His position can be compared to that of the first Christian king of Poland, Mieszko. He was baptized in 966. Poland was also just emerging as a state. It was also dealing with stuff like introducing taxes, and it saw its fair share of pagan uprisings. So far, so similar then. I think that there are really two main reasons why Christianity was ultimately rejected by the Lithuanians. Firstly, Lithuania was very remote. Other pagan nations seemed to have had more time to get used to Christianity. It was just physically easier for merchants and missionaries to get to many of these realms. Their presence was often enough to at least introduce pagans to Christian beliefs, so that with time they could become more normalized. The Baltics did not have this experience. This brings me to the second and more important reason. Christianity decided to show the Baltics an entirely different experience, namely crusade and colonization. Sure, other pagan countries fought with Christian ones before they converted, and there was plenty of bad blood there. but I cannot say that many faced what the Baltics did. The Teutonic Order fought a war to force its religion on the locals for decades. Those who refused were often just killed unceremoniously. And let me remind you that the Order's main priority was not even converting people. German nobility joined the Order to go to a foreign country, carve out a big piece of land for themselves, and force the locals to work for them. This is like the most textbook colonialism there is. In other words, I just think that the Christians fumbled the bag and showed their worst side, which rightfully put the pagans off. The next major interaction that the pagans had with the Christians happened more than half a century later. Grand Duke Gediminas consolidated the country and in 1322 started writing open letters that were meant for the entire reading public of Christian Europe. The letters themselves are incredibly valuable historical documents, as in them a pagan speaks to Christians through writing. Almost all other documents from this time are written by Christians about pagans and not the other way around. In these letters, Gediminas says that actually, we only fight the Teutonic Order because they attacked us, and not because they are Christians. He says that he has no problem with Christians and just wants the Lithuanian point of view considered. He continues on inviting people to come live in Lithuania, promises opportunities, fair treatment, and religious tolerance. His tone makes it seem like he is not merely accepting the Christian faith in his country, but that he personally is on the verge of becoming a Christian. Deciding to seize the opportunity, the Pope orders a 4-year truce between the Teutons and Lithuania, and tries to guide Lithuania back into the fold of Christian nations. But when agents of the Pope actually get to Lithuania in 1324, things don't go so well. Gediminas gives the good host, but when he is asked about his baptism, which would really seal the deal on being considered a Christian, he reacts with confusion and rejection. He says that he never wanted to leave the impression that he would be baptized, and that baptism was a ridiculous notion for him in itself. He claims that it was the fault of the Christian friar he had used as a translator. Other stories also start circulating. That opposition by Žemaitijans and the Orthodox Ruthenians was preventing him from embracing Catholicism, or that the Teutonic Order's actions had somehow caused him to turn away from Christianity again, or that he was observed crying tears of sorrow in his room when he was told he had to be baptized to be considered a Christian. So what was actually going on here? Well, Gediminas was almost certainly playing with the Christian world. He was probably sincere about the invitation to come live in Lithuania and his promises of tolerance. The Grand Dukes did execute preachers who went too far and tried to convert pagans, but there were already functioning Catholic churches in Lithuania, including in the capital, Vilnius, that served the religious needs of merchants and other foreign travelers. But everything else was part of an elaborate ruse. Like Mindaugas, he really just wanted to deal with the Teutonic Order. Continued Teuton attacks made life for many Lithuanians very difficult. By writing the letters, he had achieved his truce, and then successfully duped the agents of the Pope into believing that this was all a misunderstanding, so that the truce actually remained in effect until it expired as scheduled in 1328. Why not convert outright, though? It's true that this would end the conflict with the Teutons, but there were drawbacks too. The pagans would definitely get riled up if Gediminas went for that conversion. His power would also be restricted, as he would at least nominally have to live and rule in compliance with Christian religious norms. Connection to the rest of Europe was not as tantalizing a treat as it had been earlier. Trade had already been increasing, and a growing community of expats in Vilnius resulted in the transfer of knowledge about more advanced technologies. Even peace with the Teutons was no longer an existential question for Lithuania. It had continued its expansion into Ruthenian lands, and it seemed like there was not much in the way of Lithuania continuing to grow in size. This growth deserves closer attention. Until this point, we have been talking about converting to Catholicism, but wouldn't it make more sense to convert to Orthodoxy anyway? By the early 14th century, Orthodox Ruthenians made up more than half the population of Lithuania, and their numerical superiority would only grow in the coming decades. The Lithuanians were very pragmatic about this. Not only was the Orthodox faith tolerated, members of the pagan nobility frequently converted to Orthodoxy when they went to rule the newly conquered lands. What stood in the way of Orthodoxy becoming the official faith of Lithuania was the fact that there was basically no geopolitical reason to convert. Most powerful European nations, by that point, were Catholic, and the whole point of converting was to get close to the rest of Europe. Besides this pretty major issue, there was also the behavior of the Orthodox Church towards Lithuania. The problem was that the Orthodox Ruthenians were formally under the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. Despite what the name suggests, by 1325 this guy had put down roots in Moscow. Muscovy often fought with Lithuania, and this religious entanglement caused issues, as the Metropolitan was best buddies with the Grand Duke of Muscovy. The Orthodox Church thus turned into an instrument of enemy propaganda each time there was a war. Gediminas and his successors, the brothers Algirdas and Kęstutis, tried to defuse the situation by negotiating with the heads of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople in the hopes of creating a separate metropolis for Lithuania. But they were not completely successful. It seems that Muscovy used its influence to frustrate them at every turn, including making the Orthodox leaders view Lithuanians as just pagan Ruthenians and not their own people. Despite these challenges, it is likely that Algirdas at least thought about converting to Orthodoxy in the 1340s. He and his brother had succeeded in expanding Lithuania even further, first down to Kiev and then all the way to the Black Sea coast. Lithuania by this point was one of the largest nations in Europe, though less than a third of the population were actually Lithuanian or pagan. While converting would help with ruling over the Ruthenians, it would hardly have been genuine. The siblings were old-school pagan raiders who loved war. Despite all of the political conditions we have discussed, many remained unconvinced by the need to convert to either Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Siblings were successfully conquering their way across Eastern Europe. To them, the pagan faith seemed as strong as ever, since as pagans they were inflicting defeats on Christians. In dealing with the church, they employed the same strategy as Gediminas. Between the 1340s and the 1370s, they promised to convert on 4 separate occasions when they were in a pickle, only to go back on their promise. They didn't really fear any reprisals, as they realized that they would always be a valuable prize and target for the church, being the last pagans in Europe. The Teutonic Order was still around, but by this point was no longer shooting to kill. They realized that if they won against the Lithuanians, the order would be dissolved since it had served its purpose. So instead of trying to invade, they became more of a playground for West European nobles to prove their piety by carrying out a few raids against the pagan peasants. The two sides basically just accommodated each other for a while. In 1361, the order even succeeded in capturing Kęstutis, but let him go after a few months since they couldn't even come up with anything to ransom him for. The two brothers were ever more out of place in Lithuania. They were born in a small, mostly pagan country that had recently fallen off the radar of the Christian world. There weren't even any proper towns in Lithuania back then. But by the time of their deaths in 1377 and 1382, their realm was massive and wealthy. There was just no need for pagan warlords anymore. What they actually needed was an organized religion to control their people and legitimize their rule. The man destined to make this a reality was the next Grand Duke, Jogaila. Jogaila was the son of Algirdas. His mother was an Orthodox Ruthenian and probably exposed him to Christianity from an early age. In his 20s, he was friends with a priest in Vilnius who was destined to become the future pope. It seems that Christianity was very normalized for him. This can be seen as a result of the process I mentioned earlier. Lithuania and its capital Vilnius grew wealthier in the 14th century. With wealth came trade, and with trade came merchants and missionaries. Christianity spread from them to the local people. While some priests were executed by the pagan rulers for preaching to Lithuanians, there was hardly anything that could be done to stop this process in the long term. Once on the throne, he was faced with the issue of the Teutonic Order again. The crusade was flaring up again, and Jogaila was pressed to put the issue to bed once and for all. Thoroughly ready to accept Christianity, he just needed a good excuse to do it. Luckily, there was a single queen next door. Jadwiga, Queen of Poland since 1384, needed a husband, and Jogaila, as a ruler of a major neighboring realm, was as good a candidate as any. Jogaila declared himself ready to accept the Catholic faith, and doing it through marriage created a great excuse for all the haters. This way, he can say he got the entirety of Poland in return for converting. The deal was signed on the 14th of August, 1385, and they were married on the 18th of February following year. Jogaila was now a Catholic, and Lithuania was destined to follow. There's just the question of how the coming of Christianity actually looked like in Lithuania. There was a flurry of change in the beginning, the biggest of which was writing. Before this point, there was no written Lithuanian, and no literacy in general. Clergymen were some of the few people who were literate in medieval Europe, so by joining Christianity, you got access to these people. Obviously, being able to write helps people quite a lot. With writing came law. Vilnius was confirmed as a town with the same protected rights typical of other European cities. European notions of land ownership, that is the fact that every piece of land was ultimately the domain of some lord who you were obligated to pay rent to if you lived there, also made their way into Lithuania. Money was introduced so that people could actually pay the rent. All Lithuanians were obliged to convert to the new faith. The Ruthenians were left alone. All these changes were introduced in the space of about a month in early 1387. Jogaila was not just efficient about introducing Christianity. He had no qualms about rooting out paganism. He destroyed the pagan temple in Vilnius, the only one of its kind, and chopped down the Holy Grove. He told Lithuanians to forsake pagan traditions and get with the program. Since Lithuania was a much more stable state than it had been in the years of Mindaugas, he was of course met by pagan opposition, but it did not pose anything near the existential threat it used to. Still, the adoption of Christianity was ultimately a slow process. The churches in Vilnius that previously served the foreigners were expanded, but priests would still be foreign for a while, as they had to educate enough Lithuanians first. There was also the matter of constructing enough parish churches throughout the country, a process that was also started in 1387 but would take decades to complete. In 1436, there were still pagans being baptized, and cults around the old gods existed well into the 16th century. The average peasant probably did not notice much change. For the time of the Protestant Reformation, most common people had what can be described as an approximate understanding of their religion. People only understood as much as their priest told them, and it was frequently the case that priests in poor areas could barely read themselves. This led to significant discrepancies. Common people were also prone to superstition. In every corner of Europe, people believed in fairies as much as they did in Jesus. These superstitions were often the expression of pagan myths persevering, which in turn suggests that most converts were not forced to completely abandon their traditions. While the average peasant might not have noticed much, adoption of Christianity gave the ruler a completely different level of power and control over his population. The church was the only institution that was actually present in every corner of the country. Sure, some lord probably owned the land and lived nearby, but he was just a local guy with a bit of power. The priest was a symbol of belonging to a world that was larger than just your immediate surroundings. The priest was also an agent of the ruling class, gathering information, enforcing laws, keeping the peace. You can see why the adoption of an organized religion was often an important milestone in the process of state formation. One thing the church was not able to do was end the War of the Teutonic Order. Luckily, they had also seized lands from Poland, which really goes to show how far the order had strayed from its original purpose. The conversion of Lithuania did not matter for them, and they were determined to keep on fighting. However, they were foolish to think that they could win against the combined Polish-Lithuanian forces. Most of their leadership perished in battle on the 15th of July, 1410. The crusade was over. The conversion of the Baltic states shows the price that must be paid for violence. Initially, the only gap between the Baltic people and Christianity was a lack of contact with one another. The Baltics were a pretty remote corner of Europe that did not see many visitors, so it took a while for Christianity to get there. If things were left to run their course, as they had been in other European countries, it is possible that the Baltics would have become Christian far earlier. Instead, they were greeted with a crusade that wasn't even a crusade, it was just a war of conquest and colonization. It was so effective at shattering Baltic society that the descendants of these German colonizers were still politically dominant in Estonia and Latvia until the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1918. Over 700 years after these lands were first conquered by Adalbert of Bexovede. But was it necessary to convert at all? Lithuania was one of the largest countries in Europe. It effectively ruled over its massive Orthodox Ruthenian population and engaged diplomatically with other Christian states. Obviously, a pagan kingdom would have been cool and different if it had persevered. But Baltic paganism was more of a way of life. There was no structure to it, no enforcement. Anyone could just call themselves a priest and preach whatever they liked. It was brutal and primal, and it was just impossible to reach a higher level of societal development without reform. A Grand Duke might have made the choice to establish an official state church, to bring about the same conditions that the adoption of Christianity did. But was there really a reason to do all that work and cling to paganism when you could just copy-paste the religion of your neighbors? It really doesn't seem like avoiding Christianity was ever an option. Perhaps this is all little more than a story of rich and powerful guys playing their games while everyone else got the short end of the stick. Do you think it was that simple? What do you think this says about Christianity in the Middle Ages? Do you judge the pagans? Do you disagree with anything I said? Let me know your thoughts below. I'd like to end by saying that most of the content came from two great books: A Conversion of Lithuania, From Pagan Barbarians to Late Medieval Christians, by Darius, Baronus, and S.C. Rowell, and Lithuania Ascending, A Pagan Empire within East Central Europe, also by S.C. Rowell. Discussing things like the conversion of the Baltics with any certainty stretches the entire field of history to its absolute limit. There are hardly any sources, most of which were written by Christians who would be eager to trash pagans at every turn. But it seems like these two books really try to engage with every piece of evidence to get to the truth of the matter. I recommend checking them out if you'd like to know more. This has been Ivan with Retrospect History. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.